This is Jose Merino, Editor-in-Chief of the Neurology family of journals. The Neurology podcast provides practical information to neurologists and other clinicians to help them provide better care for their patients. Thanks for listening and have a great week.
Hi, this is Stacey Clardy from the Salt Lake City VA and the University of Utah. Today, I'm speaking with Bob Herman of Stat News. Bob is a seasoned healthcare business reporter, and on November 14th, 2023, he published an investigative piece for Stat that we're going to talk about in depth today. The title of that article is UnitedHealth Pushed Employees to Follow an Algorithm to Cut Off Medicare Patients' Rehab Care. Bob, thank you so much for joining us to discuss today.
Thanks for having me, Stacey. Appreciate it.
This is such an important topic for clinicians, especially in the U.S., but really of relevance for everyone regarding healthcare systems and what's going on behind the scenes. But for a bit of background, I'm going to try to summarize with my admittedly very basic understanding of what's going on. As I understand it, UnitedHealth has many algorithms as part of any business operations model. But your article focuses in particular on one which predicts how long patients will need to stay in a rehabilitation facility after a major medical event, whether that be, breaking a hip or having a stroke, something like that. And this algorithm is purportedly just used as a guidepost for patient recovery, right? So presumably informed by historically, how long does someone with a broken hip have to stay in rehab, which in and of itself would be fine, right? To predict anticipated expenses to an insurer. And your investigation, however, found, and I'll quote, inside the company, managers delivered a much different message that the algorithm was to be followed precisely so payment could be cut off by the date it predicted. Or put another way, another quote, UnitedHealth pressured its medical staff to cut off payments for patients in lockstep with a computer algorithms calculations, denying rehabilitation care for older and disabled Americans. So maybe if that's all correct, Bob, we start there. Can you tell us how this all works? UnitedHealth is so massive. Most of us, I think, have no idea how massive. So can you help us understand first what or who is UnitedHealth, who's paying who and for what, and which patients were affected?
Your synopsis was perfect. Just to start, UnitedHealth Group is arguably the largest healthcare company in America. And a lot of people think of United as just a health insurance company, but it is way more than that now. It is physicians, it is surgery centers, it's a pharmacy benefits manager, it is a bank, and in this case, it is also a technology vendor in a way. So UnitedHealth is all of those things. It touches almost every part of the healthcare system, at least for this series of articles that my colleague Casey Ross and I looked at. And we focused on the health insurance side, but then also these technology tools that are used to manage the care of Medicare Advantage patients, as you said, after they leave the hospital. It's all about the post-acute care. So that's the slice of UnitedHealth care that we're looking at, but it is far bigger than that.
Okay, you said Medicare Advantage, right? So that'll tend to be older Americans or Americans who are getting disability benefits for any number of reasons, right?
That's right. This is Medicare beneficiaries. So that includes all adults older than 65 or disabled Americans. And Medicare Advantage, it is a version of Medicare. So with Medicare, there's two types, right? You can either just choose the traditional Medicare program, which generally it's a pretty broad network of providers. Almost everyone participates in it. And Medicare Advantage is an alternative where health insurance companies manage those benefits on your behalf and kind of offer some extra bells and whistles. So this is the Medicare Advantage side as well.
Okay. And in the article, this program that seems to be where the algorithm is housed is called NaviHealth Predict Tool, right? And it's sometimes referred to as an AI, an artificial intelligence, but it's also explained as an algorithm. So is NaviHealth part of UnitedHealth or what's going on there?
A few years ago, UnitedHealth bought NaviHealth. And NaviHealth is this care management company where, an insurance company contracts with NaviHealth and they basically say, help us manage the post-acute transition of patients. Because after someone leaves a hospital, as you said, after maybe fracturing their hip or a stroke or some other traumatic injury, it doesn't just end after the surgery at the hospital. You have to go to a nursing home. You have to go to maybe inpatient rehab. And so NaviHealth steps in at that point and says, okay, we're going to help manage that person's care. UnitedHealth bought that company. So all types of Medicare Advantage insurers use NaviHealth, which is, again, owned by UnitedHealth, to help them manage the care of patients after they leave the hospital. And the idea behind it is, let's make sure that the person is getting the right care after they leave the hospital, that they're not just maybe sitting in a nursing home and getting care that they don't need. Let's try to manage the patient to where they should go and would help them the most. As part of NaviHealth, they have this, as you said, this NH Predict. It's a tool. It is a type of artificial intelligence. It is algorithmic, and it pools together millions of people that have gotten post-acute care. And it tries to understand how similarly situated patients have fared and how much care that they might need. So, for example, let's say someone's in a hospital. You're deciding where they should go after that to kind of rehab. You plug in all of their data, their age, their characteristics, their demographics, even down to their function level. And the algorithm runs through it and it kind of says, okay, based on similarly situated patients, they need 17 days of nursing home care. That is supposed to be a guide, but it often turns into, as we outlined in our story, it's basically a cudgel. It is, you have to follow this. And that's where the problems come in. But overall, it's a tool that helps try to predict how much care people need. And you pointed this out, like in and of itself, it's not an inherently evil idea. You want to try and make sure that someone's not in a nursing home longer than they need to be. Nobody wants to be there. But at the same time, sometimes people are very sick and they might need more than 17 days in a nursing home. And that's where the controversy comes into play.
So tell me how you became aware that something might be amiss here, and what did you find?
Yeah, this started over a year ago. We heard from a specific provider who said this was going on. They said, we're working with all the large Medicare Advantage insurers, and they keep cutting off payments for our patients, and they're citing these algorithms, and they're not giving us any insights into what's included in the algorithm or anything. There was a level of frustration that was very obvious. And so we started digging into it more, and we started obtaining both internal documents within UnitedHealth that kind of showed how NaviHealth was operating, but also just these court filings that show that a lot of times these decisions, these algorithmic decisions, were overturned. Like people were getting their care cut off after the algorithm said so, and patients and their families were appealing and they were winning. You know, an administrative judge was saying, actually, based on Medicare coverage rules, you were entitled to more days. And the coverage that UnitedHealth did was wrong. It all started, from hearing these gripes and complaints, and it just kind of snowballed into, oh my gosh, this is a thing. And it's almost protocol.
Okay, so it sounds like you really came at this investigation from all angles, and I'm guessing we're familiar with some of the patient's stories. What were some of the things that you read, that you came across, that scared you the most, knowing that your friends and family may well be subject to these kind of strange and unusual policies?
As my colleague Casey and I were writing and reporting this, we continually kept in mind that these were vulnerable patients, right? This is people in their 70s, 80s, even 90s, suffering from serious injuries or illnesses. And they had an expectation that within their Medicare Advantage plan that they would get entitled to this care. And again, these were very sick people. So when we're hearing from people and their families, when we're seeing court filings kind of outlining their situations, like these are people, they could barely walk 10 to 20 feet. They couldn't go to the bathroom on their own. We heard instances of people getting IV antibiotics and they're getting kicked out of a nursing home. Like these are not people that are just sitting in a nursing home and just like chatting it up. These were very sick people. So I think that was the very shocking part of all this is these algorithms were being applied across the board and not really paying attention to the individual characteristics of someone's case. It was, you could be in these situations and the algorithm said 17 days, you were out. Like if you can go to the bathroom yourself, it didn't matter. And I think that's the scary part of this is it didn't matter.
That's terrifying. As a clinician, I'm thinking here, we're told the one thing we need to do in our daily documentation, right, as a physician is assess how the patient's doing, and we're really supposed to put everything together and develop a plan. So I write a daily note. It's going to be any progress we've made, any setbacks the day prior, like, oh, did they get a urine infection? And so now physical therapy might not be as effective today, or we might need to take a day off, and changes and tweaks to the treatment plan. And I'm writing that really to my team members, the physical therapists, the occupational therapists, the pharmacists, the nurses, right? And so that's the goal of the note. And I know in the back of my head that there is a machinery, right, in the background that is the business of healthcare that may look at the note and say, hey, does the patient really need to be in this setting, or can we discharge him? But I think in my practice, at least, I try to keep that note focused on the patient. And I figure I can always address any questions related to payment or appropriateness of the plan if they come up. But if I'm understanding you, for these affected patients, at least, it would seem that the insurer could have cared less about anything in that patient chart, in any of the notes of the care team, and everything was being driven by this preset deadline on the calendar, and the patient was going to be denied any further therapies no matter what. Is that actually what I'm hearing happened?
Yeah, and this was like the evolution of this series as well. Like when we first started reporting last year, we knew this was happening and it was a problem. UnitedHealth routinely told us, hey, the algorithm and all the processes through NaviHealth, those are just suggestions, they're guides. We look at individual cases and we look at things on a case-by-case basis. But the story from November really kind of hammered home what you're talking about, that the clinicians on the UnitedHealth and NaviHealth side, it's not like these people didn't have backgrounds. Like, these were occupational therapists, physical therapists, nurses. These people knew what they were doing, but they were kind of handcuffed. There was explicit performance goals that said, you have to keep patients' rehab care within 1% of what the algorithm says, which in effect means follow the algorithm to a T, because 1% variance is almost nothing. So these clinicians, they have their hands tied. Either they follow the algorithm and do better on their performance goals, or they don't, and then they start getting questions from their managers. So what do you think someone's going to do? Rationally, they're going to do what they're told. And I think there was a moral crisis among some of the NaviHealth people that we interviewed, because they were doing these things. They knew. They were sending letters to patients and their families saying, hey, your time's up, even though they knew that that patient probably still needed some care. We know it just didn't sit well for everybody. And that was the result. It led to patients getting kicked out of their facilities, even though clinicians knew that they needed more care.
Right. To be clear, you're talking about the clinicians who didn't sit well with are the ones that were essentially employed by UnitedHealth to review, say, the records of a doctor like me who's boots on the ground taking care of the patient, because UnitedHealth employs a ton of sort of allied health physicians and otherwise to review the care being given by those of us who are actually in clinical practice, right?
That's right. Yes. So the patient would have their doctor who would refer them for whatever care that they think was necessary. And then the UnitedHealth and NaviHealth clinicians, they got all those charts. But again, they had to operate at the behest of the algorithm.
Right. So I guess the other question is, thinking again as a clinician who's doing this on the daily, we're often subjected by insurance companies to these endless, incredibly burdensome appeal processes and mandated what they call peer-to-peer phone calls to justify our patient care decisions, right? And this is all interfering with our ability to actually sit and care for our patients, right? The insurance companies will say, well, you have to call, you only have 24 hours to call, this, that, and the other thing, you have to submit this through a fax machine, whatever. Even if you can do that, and to your point, these are all the vulnerable patients. So there's too many of them. So no one doctor can really probably keep up. But even if we did that, it wasn't going to make a difference, right?
There was always that option. And NaviHealth reinforced that. Like, hey, you know what? Let's schedule a peer-to-peer, as you said, between us and your referring physician. But NaviHealth's clinicians told us it was a lost cause from the beginning. Maybe a peer-to-peer would be scheduled on a Friday when they knew the physician was going to be around, or right after a long holiday weekend, or it was just basically predetermined, right? You do the peer-to-peer, but it didn't matter anyway. Those appeals options were always there, but they didn't matter.
Right.
Functionally, they did not matter.
Right. And I've certainly been on those phone calls before. I tend to give them my cell phone and I tell them they can call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I have been on the calls where I said, okay, I hear you saying no to this for this patient that I think needs it. What is the alternative? And I've been on the phone calls where they say, there is no alternative. And, what do you do with that, right? What do you do? I just want to scream. But yeah, so it sounds like that may have been part of what's at play. So it really sounds like, putting on my hat as someone who has insurance now, the American public has been paying into this insurance plan that didn't actually get us what we thought we were paying for. I mean, so don't we generally think we're we're paying into a plan that will pay for the treatment that our doctors prescribe, or at least a significant portion of that treatment. Maybe we're on the hook to cover the rest. But again, am I right here? What's happening is the taxpayer, the plan payer, we're not getting that because it's what the UnitedHealth employed clinicians are prescribing, or worse, now what we're getting is actually what the programmer who wrote the algorithm thinks that the UnitedHealth employee was saying at the time when they tried to make some sort of wholesale bulk decision, right? This feels like a strange new world. Is that right?
At the center of this is all involving Medicare Advantage. And you're right. So when someone is Medicare eligible, they've been paying into the program their entire lives, there's an expectation that they're going to get benefits. But Medicare Advantage has become the dominant form of health insurance coverage for Medicare eligible people. And so Medicare Advantage plans, they can impose certain restrictions that don't exist in Medicare. And the thinking is, okay, there's fraud and abuse in the traditional Medicare program. And I think there's been some historical precedent to that. Doctors and certain companies just trying to run up the tab because they know Medicare will pay. So Medicare Advantage was instituted to say, okay, let's be a check on some of those behaviors and root out that fraud. Think of it like a pendulum. It has swung so far in the other direction that it's denying care to people who desperately need it. And it's actually even worse than that, because in those instances where these very sick people are in a nursing home and they're getting these letters saying your time's up, families are put in a pretty distressing position. They either go through this really awful appeals process that is long and arduous, and the patient themselves can't go through it, or they decide to pay out of pocket to stay in the nursing home to get the care that they need. And so people are spending down their savings, they might have to go into Medicaid, and it's just a drain on both them and their entire families. So this is a new world in which Medicare Advantage is the dominant type of Medicare coverage, but it has consequences for people who don't fully understand the trade-offs of choosing one of those plans.
Right, and it's always changing, and we're talking about people who you said are so vulnerable, and is it even realistic to expect them to understand the nuances of what they're signing up for if, as clinicians, we often don't even fully understand it, right?
That's right, yeah, and Medicare, it's not an easy program for anyone to understand, really. There's so many ins and outs. And like you said, it doesn't matter if you're a doctor, but especially if you're a beneficiary. But there's still just an expectation that you're going to get the care that you need. And this just flips it on its head a little bit. And I think it's also just very distressing because a lot of these decisions are being based on this tool, this artificial intelligence tool, machine learning. And people have no idea their decisions are being made based on that. And it's almost self-perpetuating in a way as well, because as this database of people, this algorithm starts feeding itself more and more, it's going to make these lengths of stay, even shorter in a way, because if it's telling itself, okay, this person only needs 17 days and people are getting cut off by then, it's just going to keep telling itself that this is correct, this is the way to do things, even when there are outliers, when there are people who are going to need more care. So there's a lot of unsettling dynamics to this that range from people not understanding the nuances of Medicare benefits to technology completely overhauling their Medicare benefits.
Wow. So back here, worry about the vulnerable patient. So is there even any recourse in the here and now? Back in practice, let's say that I have a patient who's very clearly denied. It seems that they are the victim of one of these algorithms and then are not fitting the norm, the bell curve. Isn't it often these care managers that work for the insurance companies, they're often physicians, right? So if they make this decision in line with an algorithm and they're essentially going against the boots on the ground clinician taking care of the patient, are they not setting themselves up for a malpractice lawsuit? Like, does that patient have any recourse, that Medicare Advantage, beneficiary? Are they allowed to get that clinician name and say, I'm going to, take this to the legal system and name that care manager? Are they allowed to do that?
I think in this instance, this involves Medicare's coverage rules. So in those instances where Medicare Advantage beneficiaries and their families think that their care was inappropriately denied, they can go through this appeals process. And we talked about, you can do a peer-to-peer first, that gets denied. Then you start going through this very long and arduous appeals process through these certain types of contractors. When I say it's long and arduous, I really do mean that. Like, there are backlogs of cases, and you're going to need outside legal help to kind of go through this to prove that not necessarily that a UnitedHealth or NaviHealth clinician committed malpractice. This is whether the coverage policies instituted by UnitedHealth run afoul of Medicare coverage rules. That is the legal route that patients have taken. And as I mentioned at the start of our conversation, Stacey, it's like we found some of these administrative law judge rulings in which judges have said, yeah, this wasn't right, like based on Medicare's coverage rules. And by the way, Medicare Advantage plans, they have to cover the same benefits that traditional Medicare does. They just have more flexibility for care denials, but they still have to offer the same amount of care. For example, they have to offer 100 days of nursing home care. And if they're not even giving that option, that's when these patients have a case. And that's where, sometimes these judges are coming into play. But again, this is a very time-consuming process. It is complicated. And UnitedHealth, in a way, knows that most patients aren't going to go through it because it is such a pain in the neck.
Right. And presumably you're sick and you're already perhaps heading toward medical bankruptcy because you're now on the hook to pay for it.
Exactly. A lot of these folks that we spoke with, we wound up speaking with their families because either the patient had died or it was just the families. As you said, if you're sick, you're most concerned about just getting better. These are families who are trying to sort through all this, whether it's spouses or their sons and daughters, whoever it might be. So it is a tall task for anyone, really, when they're most concerned about is just trying to recover from whatever illness or injury that they have.
And so your article focused a bit on UnitedHealth, which maybe this actually. I saw it quoted elsewhere at one point that UnitedHealth actually employs like 1 in 10 U.S. physicians. Do you know if that's true?
Yeah, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. Overall, UnitedHealth either employs or is affiliated with almost 1 in 10 physicians. It's a shade under 10%.
Wow.
But yeah, UnitedHealth is still probably the biggest employer. It is the largest amalgamation of physicians out there. That is, I think, certainly the case.
Wow. I bring that up only to sort of try and get my head wrapped around the scope of this. But I'm sure it's not just UnitedHealth, right? Like it's not just UnitedHealth with their Medicare Advantage plans. I'm not so naive to think that they're probably the only ones doing this. Is that fair? Yeah.
And we wrote that in our story as well, because as we said, other Medicare Advantage plans contract with NaviHealth, which is owned by United. So obviously United is going to use it for its own Medicare Advantage plans because it owns this technology. A ton of other large Medicare Advantage plans, think about like Humana or Highmark and other Blue Cross Blue Shield, Medicare Advantage plans. We're talking, big major players use NaviHealth. So this potentially affects, in our article, we estimated 15 million people. I think that's a conservative estimate.
What's our recourse? I think we've established where this leaves sort of the little guy, if you will, on an individual basis, which is not in a great place. But what about as sort of neurology clinicians or as physicians in allied health in the U.S. as a whole? Is there anything that we can do to advocate and protect these patients at the national level? Or maybe a better question is, what's the fallout? Has anything come out of your article? Where are things headed? What can we do to make this better?
There's been some swift response. Just for example, there's been a couple of class action lawsuits, one of which was filed against United and NaviHealth, and another which was filed against Humana for these very reasons, that they relied on an artificial intelligence platform that inappropriately denied care. So those class action lawsuits were filed after our reporting and they're pending. And also throughout our reporting, we actually got in touch with a lot of physicians, clinicians, lawyers, other Medicare experts who have gotten involved with kind of the bureaucratic process of how Medicare coverage rules are made. So every so often, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, that's the government agency that runs Medicare, they propose rules on Medicare Advantage policies, and that's where the public can weigh in and either voice their displeasure, voice their advocacy for whatever. And, these Medicare Advantage rules come out annually. And that's where a lot of people really take the time and effort to let the federal government know what they think. And we found a lot of people through that process. And the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services itself has, they told us that they're investigating UnitedHealth to see whether their practices do run afoul of federal rules. And overall, CMS is trying to do more with these kind of denials of care, right? They want to make sure that people who enroll in a Medicare Advantage plan aren't being kicked out of a nursing home unfairly or inappropriately. And they've proposed some rules, and some go into effect this year, actually. They just went into effect to basically tell Medicare Advantage plans, listen, you cannot deny someone based on an algorithm alone. You have to give some reasoning behind it. You have to publish the evidence that this is based on. And the government is also going to be doing more audits this year. They're going to be looking at these utilization management techniques to make sure that care is not inappropriately denied. So there are some wheels in motion, at least from a government scrutiny point of view. And then, of course, Congress can change rules as well, but it's a much bigger slog.
Sure. Do you get the sense that this has caught the attention of Congress?
Yeah, and several lawmakers have written letters to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to ramp up enforcement. So I think a lot of politicians have embraced Medicare Advantage because of the savings, and a lot of people do love the extra perks that come with the program. But I think there is a little bit of a shifting consensus that, okay, maybe it's a little too good to be true, and not everyone understands all of the intricacies of the program. So whether something happens, it's a completely different question. But there is some sentiment in Congress that this needs to be regulated way more than it currently is.
And then any other final thought from what you've taken away from this comprehensive investigation, things that we need to know perhaps to help our patients?
I think it's just one of those things that, now that it's out there, people know, these algorithmic tools are a thing and they're being used in coverage decisions. Previously that wasn't the case. People just were getting these denial letters thinking, there's got to be some kind of internal policy. But there really has been this effort from plans to save money where they can. And one big area of that is in post-acute care. It's this idea that we can root out the waste, which again, in and of itself sounds like it could be a good thing if it's used the right way, but this is not that. This is vulnerable people recovering from serious injuries and illnesses who are getting kicked out of nursing homes, kicked out of other rehab facilities because an algorithm told them so. And I think there is certainly a shifting consensus that that is not the way that we want to treat our Medicare beneficiaries. But I think we're still a long way off from making sure that stuff like this doesn't happen again.
Well, thank you, Bob, for taking the time today to break this down and explain it, and for doing the investigation. I'm sure this was not a fun investigation to undertake. I'd say not much of what we talked about today has been good news, perhaps a little bit of hope that maybe some of this will be fixed and lead to some reform.
Thanks for having me, Stacey. I appreciate sitting down and talking with you. It is very important. So I'm glad we were able to talk about it.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the most important things, because if we can't actually deliver the care, then we're in trouble in real ways. And Bob's article, again, available to Stat News subscribers. It's titled, UnitedHealth Pushed Employees to Follow an Algorithm to Cut Off Medicare Patients' Rehab Care. Check it out. And a lot of the other really great work he and the team, and Casey Ross as well, the other journalists on this article at Stat, put out really all the time. Thanks again, Bob.
Thanks so much, Stacey.
This is Stacey Clardy, your podcast editor. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please take a few moments to subscribe, rate, and review the Neurology podcast through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And remember, you can always head to neurology.org/podcast for our full list of past episodes. Or you can also search by keyword in your podcast app for any neurology-specific topics you want to learn about.